David Kringer from MHRA. This is the package of the trio from MHRA, which show a good relationship we have with MHRA College. David.
Thank you. Okay, good morning. I'm going to talk about medical devices, software, and some work we're doing on cyber security and risks. So we have some challenges with software and regulating them. If we look back at the framework for medical device regulation, the regulations implement directives from a while ago. So starting back in 1990, we've got the Active Implantable Device Directive, which is the first one. So these are quite old now and were an age where software wasn't really an issue. Another thing was the definition of a device. So you may have seen this before. What is a device? So it's a thing used on humans for one of these medical purposes and doesn't act as a medicine. So the intended purpose is determined by claims on the device, the label, instructions for use, or any promotional material made by the manufacturer. Sometimes you see this. It's not a medical device. I've got a disclaimer. So we tend to say that general disclaimers are not acceptable if claims are made or implied elsewhere in the labelling or literature. So manufacturers need to consider what can be reasonably foreseen prior to placing a product onto the market. So a device doesn't need to diagnose to be considered to be used for diagnosis, and it doesn't have to treat to be considered for treatment within the definition of a device. We also see problems with function creep, new features being added to software that isn't a device. So it may change the qualification of a product, and it may change classification of a device. For example, the recent issue with QRisk we saw, so this risk calculator was added to GP database functions. It made the whole system a device, but the manufacturers weren't really aware of that. This can be managed by manufacturers by adding CE-marked modules to their products. But can software really be a device? Back in 1993, not really. It was part of the device. In 1994, we had some guidance from Europe saying, well, if it's part of a system, it helps the function of a device, it influences the device, yes, it can. 1998, there were some updates. IVDs, software isn't included in the definition of an IVD. Up to 2007 now, and there was an amending directive for medical devices, and it specifically added software into the definition. Also added some software-specific essential requirements for validation and verification, but that was for medical devices only. As you're probably aware, there are classification rules for devices. It's a risk-based system, and there are rules within the directive, but these are mainly based on physical hazards and interactions with patients. There are no specific software rules. Software is considered to be an active device, and there is an implementing rule for software that drives or influences the use of another device. So that means that most standalone software would be class 1 unless it's considered to allow direct diagnosis. So once you've got your classification of your device, you will follow a conformity route, and again that depends on the class of the device. And for class 1 device manufacturers, they self-declare that the device is fit for placing on the market. There will be notified body involvement if their software has a measuring function, or strangely for sterility. Class 2 devices, manufacturer would usually follow a full quality assurance route. Class 2B and Class 3, where there will be full QA, a designed dossier exam by a notified body, and a declaration. So how do we enforce the regulations? So as Mark said earlier, we're the competent authority for devices. So we'll assess Allegations of non-compliance brought to us. So again, we need these reporting. We use a risk-based system. We monitor activities of notified bodies, and we investigate adverse incidents. And we do some work with Europe. So an example of where we took action on apps was in 2005. There was a paper published which said that insulin dosing apps are all really bad and unsafe. That was from Imperial College. We contacted the author, and he gave us details of the manufacturers that he'd investigated. So we had a look at those. None of them were CE marked. We wrote to the developers and asked them, would you like to CE mark, or would you like to remove these from the market? They were all Class 1 devices, so it's not an onerous process. You just needed to self-certify and register with us as a manufacturer. All the UK developers chose to remove their apps from the market, or took off the medical function bit. We informed the other member states where the app developer was based in, as they're responsible for taking action in their own state. And for non-EU apps, we blocked them through the app stores. So we've also taken other action against non-CE marked software for assessment of moles, melanoma, monitoring Parkinson's disease, some bioresonance products, and cardiovascular risk calculators. And again, we have a dedicated email address for reporting to. We also have guidance that we published for app developers, and we've recently added some guidance on how to label your app with CE mark display. So, as you've heard earlier on this morning, the directives are changing. There's an extension of scope, the legislation, there'll be better supervision of notified bodies, there'll be clear rights for economic operators, and stronger requirements for clinical evidence. And the guidance that we have currently is put into regulations, so it's not guidance, it's a requirement. The device regulations are now in force, and for general devices they'll apply from 2020. Okay, so the new regulations apply to devices placed on the market or put into service from 26th May 2020. So this includes updates to existing software devices, and certified medical devices have up to an extra 2 years to be in compliance. So what are the changes for software? In-house developed devices will now be regulated. They won't require full CE marking. Essential requirements for software will now specifically cover security and unauthorized access. There's a new specific software rule that should cover the risk that the software has. Any software intended to be used to take decisions with a diagnostic or therapeutic purpose will be now at least a Class 2A device. And any devices that are now Class 1 devices must be removed from the market until they're recertified by a notified body from that date. And yes, I've done it before. So for the in-house manufacturing, the new requirements will apply if the product isn't transferred to another legal entity. The manufacturer and use is under an appropriate quality management system, and the health institutions justified that patients' needs cannot be met or cannot be met at an appropriate level by an equivalent device on the market. There's appropriate documentation, and the health institution has made a publicly available declaration that they're doing this. We have at the moment a consultation on the process. We've got draft guidance, and the consultation is open until March next year, so there's plenty of time to comment on it, look at it, tell us how good or bad it is. So we were all glad to see that the new directives have a software classification rule, although it is widely open to interpretation. as it's looking at software intended to provide information which is used to take decisions with a diagnosis or therapeutic process, and it's classed as Class 2A, except if such decisions have an impact that may cause death or an irreversible deterioration of a person's state of health, in which this is case it's a Class 3 device, or a serious deterioration of a person's state of health, in which case it's Class 2B. So the may cause is open to interpretation. You could say that any software may cause or lead to death, in which case all software should be Class 3. So there's also a rule for monitoring which follows the previous Rule 10. So there's a Class 2A or Class 2B if it's immediate danger to the patient. And all other software is classed as Class 1, although we're looking to see what would be Class 1. So the IMDRF, or an International Medical Device Regulators Forum, looked at device classification in 2013 and came up with a risk-based system of looking at classifying software. We're working with Europe at the moment, and we're going to see if this works for classifying software in the future. So the Class 3 devices would be those where there's a need for prompt diagnosis or treatment in a critical situation or condition, and then you can work from the grid down to lower risk, lower need for the information, down to a Class 2A, as that's the minimum classification. So most software will be up-classified to Class 2A or above. The manufacturers will need a notified body involvement before placing on the market. So manufacturers need to be consulting notified bodies soon if they want to keep their products on the market. The unique device identifier will also apply to software. So where there's changes to performance, safety of the software, or how the software interprets data, we'll need a new UDI device identifier number. Minor notifications will just require a product identifier number change. There'll also be requirements for importers and distributors, so app stores. They should be or will be checking that software has been CE marked, there's a declaration of conformity, the device is accompanied by all the information needed, that a manufacturer and authorised representative is identified, UDI requirements are met, all the contact details are there, and if they don't believe a device is in compliance, they will need to contact us and report it to us. There are changes to essential requirements about interaction with IT environment, how the software is, so interoperability and compatibility, and measures to prevent unauthorized access, so that software should run as intended. And there's also a huge amount of work looking at devices intended for lay persons. So there are 3 new essential requirements that are popped in. So the manufacturer, if it's intended for a lay person, then they have to consider skills, means available for a lay person, etc. Instructions for use, again, will have to include information about IT and security measures and how to run the software as intended. We're working at European level at the moment. I'm on the work group looking at classification, and we're expecting guidance on software classification soon. We're also looking at cybersecurity issues, currently considered as abnormal use, and it's not being considered reportable by manufacturers. And we're planning to produce some vigilance guidance on cyber issues, what should be reported, and what actions would be considered field safety corrective actions, as we think manufacturers aren't doing that at the moment. And that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, David.